1 Kings 18. Now, last week, obviously, we took a look at the beginning and the end of this chapter, which dealt mostly with the drought that had been taking place, 3.5 years of drought, beginning and ending, both with this prayer by Elijah. And then obviously here in the middle of the chapter, there is another very, very important event that takes place. And it's related to the drought, but it's much broader in its implication. And so I want to start reading in verse 17. Now we looked at verses 17 and 18 last week, but just to grab the context here. So 1 Kings 18, verse 17, "And it came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? And he answered, he said, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, and that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and thou hast followed Baalim." And then we pick it up in verse 19. "Now, therefore send and gather to me all Israel unto Mount Carmel, and the prophets of Baal 450, and the prophets of the groves 400, which eat at Jezebel's table." And so Ahab sent unto all the children of Israel, and gathered the prophets together unto Mount Carmel. And Elijah came to all the people, and he said, How long halt you between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him not a word. And then said Elijah unto the people, even I only remain a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let them therefore give us 2 bullocks, and let them choose 1 bullock for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire under. And I will dress the other bullock, and lay it on the wood, put no fire under. And you call upon the name of your gods, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God that answered by fire, let him be God. And all the people answered and said, It is well spoken. And Elijah said unto the prophets of Baal, Choose you 1 bullock for yourselves, and dress it first, for you are many. And call on the name of your gods, but put no fire under. And they took the bullock which was given unto them, and they dressed it, and they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, nor any that answered. And they leaped upon the altar which was made. And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them, and he said, Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth, and must be awake. And they cried aloud, and they cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets, till the blood gushed out upon them. And it came to pass when midday was past that they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that there was neither voice, nor any to answer, nor any that regarded. And Elijah said unto all the people, Come near unto me. And all the people came near unto him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, unto whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be thy name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 measures of seed. And he put the wood in order, and he cut the bullock in pieces, and he laid him upon the wood, and said, Fill 4 barrels with water, and pour it on the burnt sacrifice, and on the wood. And he said, Do it the second time, and they did it the second time. He said, Do it the third time, and did it the third time. And the water ran round about the altar, and he filled the trench also with water. And it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near, and he said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. It says, Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, The Lord, he is the God, the Lord, he is the God. And Elijah said unto them, Take the prophets of Baal, and let none of them escape. And they took them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon, and slew them there. And that's where we'll stop this morning. And so, as I said, this is related to the drought, insofar as we talked about last week, or a couple weeks ago, I think now, that Baal was seen as it was a fertility god, and oftentimes referred to as a storm god. He was a fertility god in that he was in control of the weather. And so if you were dependent upon agriculture, which obviously many of them were, you were completely dependent upon the rain and to come at the appropriate times. And so they considered Baal this agriculture god, this fertility god, storm god. And so for God to cease the rain was a direct attack upon their worship of this false god. And so this is kind of setting the scene for us here for Mount Carmel. And so Elijah and Ahab, they finally meet. We talked about all that last week. After this long drought period, And Ahab accuses Elijah, you're the one causing all this trouble. And, of course, Elijah lets him know, no, it's not me, it's you. And then he tells Ahab, he says, to gather to me all Israel to Mount Carmel, the prophets of Baal 450, the prophets of the groves 400, which eat at Jezebel's table. Now, and that's just an interesting addendum there, that these other 400 prophets eat at the table. By the fact that they're eating at Jezebel's table would suggest, and we can't be definitive about this, but would suggest that these were state-sponsored. I mean, if they're eating at the table of the queen, the state is feeding them. And so this isn't just, the suggestion of Ahab and Jezebel for people to worship these gods. This is state-sanctioned and state-sponsored paganism. That's what this has become. They're actually paying, if in no other way by food, these false prophets. But nevertheless, Elijah tells Ahab, right, go gather all the people. And so Ahab, and he does this, and I think, and this is my opinion on this, I think probably Ahab thinks this might be the only way for this drought to stop. Obviously, Elijah said it was going to happen, and it happened, and now Elijah has told him it's going to end. But maybe Ahab thinks if I don't listen to Elijah, it won't end. But for whatever reason, Ahab listens, and he does. He goes and he gathers. We don't know how many. But he goes through Israel and he calls the people here to Mount Carmel. And then on that, it is interesting that this is the place that Elijah chooses for this confrontation to happen. Because there is evidence, and there's good evidence, a lot of evidence to suggest that Mount Carmel was a sacred site of Baal worship. That there was probably at least some kind of shrine there at bare minimum. But Mount Carmel was kind of seen as a sacred, holy site with regards to the worship of this false god. And so, as we talked about last week a little bit, but Elijah was going to prove definitively God's power over Baal, and he was going to do it, to use maybe lack of a better phrase, on Baal's home turf. Right? And so, again, we understand that it's not really his home turf because the whole earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. But in the eyes of his worshipers, right, they would have seen this as, oh, we've got home court advantage in this battle because this is Baal's place. And so this is, again, Elijah is setting the scene to make this undeniably so that there was no way an Israelite could walk away from this particular confrontation and think anything other than Baal is a false god. He must be, based upon what has been happening not only the past 3.5 years, but on this particular day. And so with the people now gathered, Elijah really puts before them the issue at hand, right? And so he asks them, he says, how long halt you between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. And so, the word halt here refers to being almost crippled, lame on your feet kind of thing. And so Elijah says, you've been limping back and forth between following God and following Baal, right? So sometimes you might, and what I think he means by this is that there were still vestiges of the covenant worship taking place. They were probably still bringing their lambs to sacrifice every now and then, probably still doing the Day of Atonement, but it was all a show. It was all just to carry through with the motions because they had added to that all this false worship of Baal and others. He wasn't the only false god being worshipped. And so Elijah says, you're limping back and forth. You're pretending to worship God over here, but you're also worshiping Baal over here. You're worshiping Asherah. You're worshiping all these other false gods. And so how long are you just going to be limping all over the place, spiritually speaking? And so Elijah here, what's important for us to understand is he doesn't allow them. He doesn't allow them to just say, I will recognize that the Lord is God. No, you have to not only recognize it, but he also demands obedience, right? He doesn't just say, if the Lord be God, then acknowledge it. He says, if the Lord be God, follow him, right? Follow him, right? And so again, what is he saying? You cannot claim to be a follower of God and have Baal in your back pocket. You can't do that, right? You're not a follower if you're going over here and doing all this other false stuff. And this is the same thing Jesus said in Matthew 6. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. This is exactly what was happening. And I think this story, more than any other, really testifies to us how much false Baal worship had captured the hearts of the Israelites. And we'll see this more in just a second. But they were pretending to be followers of God, but to use the words of Jesus, were really despising him because they were truly following the other. Now, of course, he says the same thing for Paul, right? If he's God, follow him, right? I mean, there can't be many gods, right? So somebody's God, somebody's not. Find out who it is and follow him. And then, again, sadly, what does the text tell us? The people answered him not a word. Not a single person stood up that day and said, no, it's God. It's not Baal. It's God. And so, again, Elijah, now we understand from earlier in this chapter, we saw this last week, that there were other true prophets, that they had been hidden, they had been hunted, Jezebel trying to kill them all, but some of them had been saved, and they were being kind of protected and cared for. They just weren't here, right? They weren't here at this particular point. And so Elijah a couple of times makes this statement, I'm the only one. Either he's completely disregarding what Obadiah had said earlier in the chapter. I don't think that's the case. I think what he means by this is, in this particular confrontation, it is only him. The other prophets, they're not there. Again, they're being hidden away. And so nobody, again, Elijah's the only one who stands up and makes a case for God. And so what does it show? It shows us how successful Ahab and Jezebel were in their endeavor to bring in this false worship into Israel. They didn't just bring it in. It took over, and it reigned supreme when it came to the hearts of the people to worship. And so this, we see how fickle the Israelites were. And I don't want to say it's just them. I mean, people in general were fickle people. But here, this is what we're talking about. We see how fickle they were, where they're always chasing the newest, shiniest thing, right? We've got God, that's fine, but look how much fun all these pagans are having over here. We want a little bit of that. And so they're always chasing some new thing. And here it had led them into a very dangerous spiritual position. And so Elijah gives the challenge. And again, it's simple. It's not a difficult thing to get. 2 bulls, the 450 prophets get one, Elijah gets the other. Both of them would dress it, put it on the altar, no fire. You pray to your God, your false gods. I'll pray to the Lord. I like how Elijah words that. And we'll just see, right? We'll put the test out there, and we'll just see. Now, again, keep in mind, who is Baal in the eyes of the people? He's the storm god. It should be real easy for the storm god to just zap a little lightning down there and suck up that offering, and just it's going to be fine. And so, again, from the eyes and the minds of his worshipers, they're probably thinking, he couldn't have given us an easier challenge. This is simple. Right? Baal will prove himself, and that'll be the end of it. We can just be rid of Elijah. They probably would have killed him, right? And so we can be done with this whole thing. And so this is what they do. And so each group would call on their God. The God that answers by fire, let him be God. Everybody's okay with this, right? All the people answered. Now, again, earlier, they don't say a word. Elijah says, how long are you going to limp between these two gods, right? They don't say a word, but here it says all the people answered and said it is well spoken. Oh, this is good, Elijah. This is fine. We'll go ahead and just win this little contest real fast, and we'll be done with this. It's simple. It is effective. As I said a while ago, this would demonstrate, this would be a demonstrable and an undeniable proof of God's power and sovereignty. Obviously, in particular, over this particular false god, but just in general. Nobody else does what God can do because there are no other gods. And so, they begin. The 450, they take their bull and they do what they're supposed to do. They dress it, they put it on the altar. They began praying and doing all the things that they thought they needed to do. And then the text tells us there was no voice. There was no response. There was no voice. There was no response because there was no God. Baal doesn't exist. What they had done, and what all false worship is ascribing to something that is not real, demonic powers of evil. That's what you're doing. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, right? All you Corinthians are going down to this temple, to this false god, and it's just stone. It's just wood. It doesn't exist. But what is it? It's actually a demon. That's what you're worshiping. You think you're worshiping Zeus. You think you're worshiping Apollos or whatever. What you're worshiping is an actual demon. That's what you're doing. And so the Israelites here, they're not worshiping Baal because Baal doesn't exist. But you know what does? Demons. And that's what they're worshiping. And so there was no voice. There was no response because Baal's not real. And so they begin to jump up on the altar in what is likely some desperate attempt to get his attention. Now, you gotta remember, and I'm sure probably everybody has at least understanding of this, but the pagan system of gods, right? They saw them typically as well. First of all, they were real beings, but they kind of acted almost like humans do. They're aloof, right? They'll pay attention to humans when they want to, but they still sleep, they still eat, they still have all these kind of normal functions that they do. They're just very powerful, in particular over certain areas. Again, for Baal, agriculture, fertility, that kind of thing. And so at this point, they're trying to get his attention, right? We've got to make ourselves big and loud. We've got to make sure that he sees us, that he knows what's going on. Because, of course, the gods that they supposedly worshiped were not omnipresent. They were not omniscient. They were not any of these things. And so it was then, at this point, that Elijah just begins to mock them. And mocks them in such a potent way, right? He says, you guys you need to be louder, right? Maybe he went on a journey. Maybe he's just asleep. Maybe he's just took a little trip, right? Just get loud and you'll get his attention. Now, and I do want to point this out, and it's ridiculous, and you wouldn't even think it's necessary. But when Elijah starts to mock them, and let's see what verse is verse number 27. Yeah, verse 27. It came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, "Cry aloud, for he is a god." So this phrase here, he is a god. There are some people who said, no, Elijah admits that he's a god, right? And so other gods exist, and Elijah admits it. No, he's being sarcastic. I mean, the fact that people don't get this is beyond me. But Elijah's sarcastically saying, hey, you think he's a god, right? I mean, if he's a god, he's a god. He's doing God things, right? So just cry, be loud, get his attention. He'll come back. He'll surely. So again, he's being sarcastic. Again, you almost think that doesn't need to be said, but apparently for some people it does. Now, and I just want to make a note on this. There is a place for Christian mockery. There is a place where the evil, wicked deeds of pagans need and deserved to be mocked. Elijah, I do not believe, was sinful here. I do not believe Elijah was sinning at all in this situation when he begins to mock these prophets. Now, let me say this. Two things on that. Number one, I think we're seeing in our society what happens when we don't allow wickedness to be mocked. There are things taking place in our society right now that just 20, 30 years ago were mocked relentlessly, but now you're not allowed to mock it. Why? Because we have to tolerate it. And so instead of mockery, they're making it even almost illegal at times to mock certain wicked deeds, and we're seeing the fruit of that, right? And so if some things need to be mocked into oblivion, and it would be a net benefit for our society. But also, secondly, and we have to remember this as well, as Christians, whereas I do think there's times where mocking is appropriate and even necessary, we need to never forget that our speech matters. We need to never forget that if we're going to mock, we mock in a way that honors Christ, and we don't do it in a way that itches the ears of the pagans, right? We need to make sure that our speech is above reproach. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are forgetting that. Whereas they may have good intentions to mock paganism, things like this, they're doing it in really detestable ways. And that doesn't need to be done either. And so, nevertheless, Elijah, crying out, just get loud, right? He'll hear you eventually. And what I think is so funny is that verse 28, it says, and they cried aloud. So they do that. Yeah. So in the middle of verse 27 where it says he is pursuing, that word means to go out on your own. That's all the word means. And so some people took that and said, well, that means Elijah says he's on the toilet, which you're reading into it what it doesn't say. And so you don't have to go that far with it. Yeah. So, but I do find it so hilarious that it seems like they listened to Elijah. Elijah says, hey, he needs to be woken up. And so what do? They cry louder. they get louder. Maybe Elijah's got a point here. Let's get loud. And so they do this. They get loud, and look at verse 20. They cut themselves after their manner with knives and lances till the blood gushed out upon them. And so they begin to engage fully in the pagan practices of the day. And I just want to say this, again, just another quick note here. 2 times in the book of Leviticus, there's a condemnation against the cutting of the flesh. And what I find interesting is you read through the book of Leviticus and you might think, why in the world does God need to require or command something so ridiculous as that? Because God knew what they would be drawn with. God knew the kind of paganism that they were going to face, and God knew the kind of practices that the pagans were involved with. What do the pagans do? They cut themselves in worship to their false gods. Why? Because that's what the demons are telling them to do, to go back to what we talked about earlier. But they cut themselves in worship of these false gods, and so God tells them in Leviticus twice, don't do this. And again, you read through Leviticus and you think, well, that seems unnecessary, and then you get to 1 Kings 18, and you read this. Who's cutting themselves? These are not Canaanites. These are not other people in other nations. These are Israelites who had been so taken over by the worship of this false god that here they are crying out to him, literally cutting themselves, the text says, until the blood rushes out upon them. Right? And so we see here God knew exactly what he was doing when he gives us or gives the Israelites those commands in the book of Leviticus, because he understands this is going to be used to draw them away from me and to lead them into these false religious practices. And so here again, they're doing this sickening display, and this isn't something that they just thought of in the moment. No, this was a kind of a normal practice for these pagan gods. And so this goes on for some time, and it says, verse 29, it came to pass when midday was past. And so for hours they've been doing this, and obviously to no avail. And again, it tells us again at the end of verse 29, for the second time we read that there was neither voice nor any to answer, nor any that regarded. And so literally for hours they had been crying and jumping on the altar and cutting themselves and doing all this other stuff, and for nothing. And obviously all of us knew, even if that wasn't there, we know that would have been the end result, because they're praying to nothing. And so Elijah finally kind of just decides, okay, you've had your time. Right, for hours, and I think he intentionally let this go on for a long time for everybody to see. Right, this is the practices that you have brought into the land. These are the practices that you have allowed, that you are involved with. This is what you would rather do than serve and worship God alone. And so he lets it go on for a long time, and then finally it's time for him to act. And so, and interestingly, we get a little note here. Before he could do anything, in verse 30, it said that he had to repair, at the end of verse 30, he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. All right, and so here again, this is very much on purpose that the Spirit inspired this. What is one of the reasons why the worship of Baal became so prevalent? Because they went and they broke down the altars to God, right? They removed any semblance of the reminder of the covenant. One might say they excluded God from the public square. And so again, to pull this out into today, why do you think there is such an attempt to silence Christians? There is such an attempt to remove God from the public sphere. Because the more people are faced with reminders of God, the more they are put face to face with the consequences of their own sin. And as Jesus said, men loved darkness rather than light. They don't want that reminder. And so we'd rather just silence Christians. We'd rather just remove those reminders. And here, and I'll say this, here in the United States, we've had it far better than people have it in many, many parts of the world. And we need to thank God for that. But that does not mean that there are not concerted efforts right now that are gaining steam to ramp up the persecution against Christians in our own country. And eventually it'll happen. When, I don't know. But eventually it will happen. And to what degree, I can't say. But there's coming a time. Things are not getting better. Things are going to get worse. And so that time is coming. But that doesn't mean we just sit back and do nothing. No, we fight for the truth. We say what's right. And we call people to repentance. That's what we're supposed to do. And so Elijah had to repair the altar. And so to repair it, and I find this so fascinating, he goes and he gets 12 stones. And we're specifically told this in verse 31, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, unto whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be thy name. And so we're not even left to guess why he did this. He gets 12 stones. He uses these 12 stones to build this altar. Why? Because this was a symbol. The Israelites, and here I'm going to include all of them, Israel and Judah together. The Israelites were always supposed to be a united fellowship of people together worshiping the one God, right? That's what they were supposed to be. Very, very early on, that began to not be the case, right? Where we're told from the very beginning that 2.5 of the tribes decided to settle outside of the land with the other 9.5. And so even before the land of Canaan was fully settled, there was already kind of a disunity, already a little bit of that broken fellowship that existed. Now the whole kingdom has been split, and now in the northern Israel you have some followers of God, not many, you have some followers of God, but then all the others are following these various pagan gods. Right? And so what is Elijah showing them? We're supposed to be united and together in our fellowship. We're supposed to be united together in our worship of God. And so these 12 stones together form this singular altar to prove the singularity that should exist within Israel instead of the broken, disunified idolaters that Israel had become. Right? And so the altar itself was a symbol to the people that this is what you should be. And then it's as if he could point over there and say, that's what you've become. Right? Again, everything about this should have been a stark picture to the people who were witness to it, and it did. We'll see the effects of it here in a moment. Now, in Elijah's reckoning, the test was still too simple. And let's just be honest, it was a simple test. There's not a test that you could put before God that would have been difficult. Right? There is no difficult test for God. But nevertheless, in Elijah's reckoning, this was still too simple, if for no other reason than to let everybody else see this. And so he digs this trench, and we're specifically told that it would hold, in verse 32, that it would hold 2 measures of seed. And again, anytime you get into the measurements, particularly in the Old Testament, they're not exact. There's a range. And so the best estimate I could find would be about 3 to 5 gallons of water. This is not a large altar, obviously. It's just holding this one bowl. But nevertheless, 3 to 5 gallons of water for a trench around the altar. And then he has these 4 barrels. And these barrels, just to mitigate this, when we hear the word barrel, we probably think of, these large plastic things. That's not what this is talking about. A barrel for them would have been something that they used to carry their water from a well to their home or something. This would have been something that a person could carry. Now, that doesn't mean it's small, but it would have been something a single person could carry. And so they had 4 barrels of water poured over the whole altar and over the sacrifice itself. And then interestingly, again, Elijah has them do that 3 more times, meaning what? 12 barrels of water poured over the altar. Again, we have the number 12 there, all for a purpose. And so now he finally feels like this is sufficient. This should show definitively, even more so than it would have already, this should show definitively the power of God. And so feeling the sacrifice was sufficiently consumed with water, it was now time for Elijah to pray for God to consume it with fire. Right? And this is exactly what he does. Now, again, notice the contrast. Elijah doesn't hop up on top of the altar and begin crying and screaming and cutting himself. That's not what he does. He just prays. That's all he has to do. He just prays. And it's a short, simple prayer. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. That's all he has to say. And at that, the fire comes. So Elijah's heart was for the glory of God. That's what he desired. That's what we should all desire. And so he wanted God to be glorified, and he wanted Israel to recognize, acknowledge, and serve that glorious God, right? That's what he wanted to happen as a result of all this. And I would say, and I didn't put it in there, maybe I should have, I think there's a very interesting parallel between this and when Jesus prays at the tomb of Lazarus, right? Jesus specifically says in that prayer, I am praying so that they hear this. That's what he said, right? I am praying so that they hear this, so that they know why this is happening, right? And so here Elijah prays, and he says what? God, I want them to know. I want them to know that you are God, and I want them to have their heart turned back again. And so this simple prayer received a very powerful response. It says, then the fire of the Lord fell. It consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood, the stones, the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. There was no doubt. There was no doubt about this. And I love the fact that God does this. He doesn't just take the bull. He takes the bull and everything surrounding it, even the water, right? And so, again, there was no question. Here you have these guys for hours crying out and doing all the things they were doing. Nothing, not a response, not a spark on the altar. And here Elijah prays this simple prayer, and God licks up the very water that he consumed the sacrifice with. And so, again, no question, no comparison. Again, it should have been obvious to every single person there, including Ahab, exactly what was taking place. And so we do see, at least in the Israelites themselves, outside of Ahab, we do see a good response. And so seeing the grand display, it says the people fall on their faces. This is verse 39. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, the Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God. Now, they should have known this already. This should have never been a question. But nevertheless, now this simple test of Mount Carmel made this, again, as I said earlier, demonstrably and undeniably true. It's not Baal. It has always been God. Right? And I will add to this. He didn't leave them or forsake them. He could have, maybe should have, but he had a covenant to keep. He had promises that he had to be faithful to. And he loved this people, even in spite of their constant turning away from him. I mean, you can go all the way back to the book of Numbers. It does not take long for God to bring them out of slavery before they, not just figuratively, before they are literally begging Moses, just let us go be slaves again. We're tired of this wilderness. We'd rather just go be slaves again. And so through all this, God never forsakes his people. And so the only thing left to do then, remember Elijah's command at the beginning. Don't just acknowledge God, follow him. Right? You can't just proclaim, yeah, I believe in God. No, you have to put that faith into action. This is what we'll talk about this morning. Right? Faith isn't just conviction. It is that, but it's a conviction that acts. Right? And so faith here, he says, don't just acknowledge God, follow God. And so the only thing left to do is to put that newfound allegiance to the test, and they must obediently follow his command. Now there's other portions of the Old Testament I could have put here, but this one was really succinct. Exodus 22:20, he that sacrificeth to any God save unto the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. There's no wiggle room in that. This is a black and white commandment. If you sacrifice to anybody other than God, you are to be destroyed. Right? There's no question as to what that means. Now, you can debate as to the proper means of destruction, but there's no debate that the person needs to be destroyed. And so here, this is exactly what Elijah commands. Verse 40, Elijah said to them, take the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape. It says, they took them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon, and he slew them there. And so Elijah, now he does the killing. I mean, he's the prophet of God. I think that was the appropriate thing. However, he has them involved, right? Now, obviously, there was a practical concern here as 1 against 450, but if God wanted Elijah to do it all alone, he could have done it all alone. That's not the issue. The issue is having the people take a step of obedience. That was the issue. And, mind you, a very difficult step of obedience. This was not a simple thing to do. Right? These are the priests whom they have been following for some time. These are the priests who they have probably given their heart of devotion to and followed and listened to their every word for some time. And so the immediate step of obedience that God through Elijah calls them to is not just stop listening to them and follow God. No, it's follow God by putting them to death. Right? Again, obedience does not mean it's going to be easy. Jesus, what did he say? Pick up your cross daily and follow me. That's not an easy thing to do. The understanding of the command is easy. The following through of the command is not. John says in 1 John chapter 5, he says his commandments are not grievous, but he doesn't say his commandments are easy. He says it's a joy to follow the Lord, but that doesn't mean it's easy to follow the Lord. Right? There's a difference in the two. And so here, they're called to immediate obedience, and that first step of obedience is quite a doozy. Right? And yet, they do it, right? They show that they have turned their heart to the Lord. Now, again, just like we see with Israel all the time, it doesn't last. Unfortunately, it doesn't last. It's very temporary. It's not a permanent. Now, I would submit that for many of the people who witnessed there, that for them individually, it was permanent. For them individually, they did fully turn back to God. But I'm talking about Israel as a whole, as a nation. Again, it's a temporary thing, and it doesn't last, unfortunately. But the people had drifted so far from God, it took this massive display of himself to draw them back. But that is what the altar is for. Right? That is always what the altar is for. We could say that's what Calvary is for. And so I'll close with this quote from Davis. The Carmel contest proves not only that Yahweh is truly God, but that he is truly gracious. He is not only the real God, but the reconciling God. Yahweh's fire is both an overt proof and a subtle invitation. And so again, there are massive implications of this story on Mount Carmel, spiritual as well as physical. But here, this was necessary. It became necessary for something so drastic. And so to parlay that into kind of a New Testament terms, it was necessary because of our rebellion, speaking as Gentiles, because of our rebellion to God, for him to do something massive and drastic. And what did he do? He sent his own son to the cross. All right? And so this is the massive display of God's love and reconciling power to us, as it was for the Israelites who witnessed the display on Mount Carmel that day. And so Elijah then becomes this very prominent, obviously, character. And what's so interesting is that Elijah is such this huge name, biblically speaking, and really is not in the Bible all that much. Right? We kind of talked about this with Solomon a little bit. Solomon, again, is this huge name. Doesn't get near the amount of, you could say, page time as David or Saul or some of these other kings. But because of the things that he did, he came on the scene so suddenly and had all these big displays of power. God used him in such a mighty way because it was necessary because of the devastating spiritual state of the people. It took grand displays of the miraculous power of God to bring them back. And so again, thankfully for us, we have Calvary. We have Calvary that did that for us. And that's what we need to turn to. We don't have to worry about Carmel. We need to worry about Calvary. And so this is, again, a very, very important, fascinating story. And so we'll continue to look at this. We'll get a couple more chapters of the dynamic that takes place between Ahab, Jezebel, and Elijah. In the next chapter, it's so stark, the difference between Elijah in chapter 18 and Elijah in chapter 19, that God is going to have to do a little mini Mount Carmel for Elijah. And so we'll see that in chapter 19. But let me pray. We'll be dismissed.